I'm humbled by the Oswald Spengler Society's recognition of my work and by your presence here this evening. When I began writing under the pseudonym Spengler 30 years ago, I had no expectation of a wide audience. It is as surprising to me as it is heartening that my protest against prevailing wisdom found residence in the public sphere. I should like to commend you all for your support of the Oswald Spengler Society. For reasons I'll attempt to explain, Spengler's work today is indispensable to our understanding of our past and our capacity to deal with our future, if indeed any there be. As a caveat, I'm a practitioner. I learned from Spengler as a man of government, but as Dr. Otis said, we're not going to talk about current events. Nichts von Vergänglichen, wie es auch geschah, uns zu verewigen, sind wir ja da. Now, 50 years ago, William F. Buckley asked Henry Kissinger why he had given President Nixon a copy of the Untergang des Abendlandes, and Kissinger said, "The reason I discussed this with President Nixon was to emphasize that the manifestation of events that come up in the form of tactical decisions are often quite misleading, and the statesman has to understand that there are many seemingly unrelated manifestations of a total culture that affect the scope of policy and the direction that it can take." I was much less interested in the predictions of Spengler than in his perceptions. Now, what Spengler showed us is that the seemingly unrelated manifestations of a total culture, in Kissinger's words, drama, music, architecture, art, mathematics, and science, inform the identity of a people, and only by grasping a culture in its totality can we uncover the underlying dynamic of political events. Der Untergang des Abendlandes should be our modern speculum principis, our textbook for training leaders, required reading for statesmen in training. I was talking with Dr. Orta about perhaps developing an annotated edition which would make it easier for the less educated contemporary audience to follow Spengler's arguments. And this is exactly Spengler's biography. As he says, before the war, he wanted to involve himself in politics, but he concluded that first he must address die oft geahnten, zuweilen berührten, nie begriffenen Beziehungen, welche die Form der bildenden Künste mit denen des Krieges und der Staatsverwaltung verbindet. Die tiefe Verwandtschaft zwischen politischen und mathematischen Gebilden derselben Kultur, zwischen religiösen und technischen Anschauungen, zwischen Mathematik, Musik und Plastik. Now, what do we say today when the classical style of composition survives only in the cinema, and the random dribbling of Jackson Pollock brings a higher price than Rembrandt? Spengler is still the Virgil who will guide us through this inferno. The decisive issue of our time is identity. On both sides of the Atlantic, conservatives, if anyone is not a conservative here, I apologize, are unanimous in opposing the destruction of national identity in favor of global governance, supranational sovereignty, and mass migration that dilutes and ultimately dissolves the Volksgeist of distinct nations. But once we attempt to define the differentia specifica of Volksgeister, our unanimity vanishes. We Americans have a standing quarrel over whether we are a creedal nation defined by our founding documents and political theory, or a Kulturnation, the heir of English tradition. In today's Germany, to defend German identity is to invite accusations of extremism. But there is no agreement, not even a coherent debate, on what German identity might be. And this question soon may be moot. Perhaps up to 500,000 languages have been spoken on this planet since the dawn of man. There are 7,000 spoken today. 9/10 of these will be extinct in a short period of time and among surviving spoken languages, perhaps only Hebrew and Aramaic would be intelligible to people who lived 3,000 years ago. How many European languages will still be spoken in 200 years as the indigenous population shrinks? Franz Rosenzweig, through whom I came to Spengler, said that Spengler was the greatest philosopher of history since Hegel. But Spengler rejected Hegel's vision of the serene procession of the Weltgeist through history. It is the prospect of failure that elicits our impassioned commitment to our culture. We should have no such love for a nationhood that merely makes a deposit in the collective treasury of the Weltgeist and then retires from the stage of history. Spengler's main competitor in geopolitics is the pseudo-Hegelianism of Alexander Kojève as channeled by Francis Fukuyama, the so-called end of history. For 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, American foreign policy proceeded from a delusion that all peoples had the same destiny, namely to embrace liberal democracy and free markets, and that geopolitics simply meant subordinating the nations of the world to supranational institutions that impose a global norm on the recalcitrant nations of the world. And this delusion, of course, created endless mischief. The Fukuyamites, the neoconservatives, hallucinated the advent of democracy in the Muslim world. Modernity, however, is toxic to traditional societies. The most modern Muslim countries, those with high levels of female literacy, entered a demographic tailspin several decades ago. At constant fertility, the combined working age population of Turkey and Iran will fall from about 125 million now to 75 million at the end of the century. Pakistan and Afghanistan, with the lowest levels of female literacy, will rise to over 800 million people from 170 million today at constant fertility. Now, fertility won't be constant for all the usual reasons, but the center of gravity of the Muslim world is shifting away from modernizers to the most backward countries. Spengler understood this uniquely among his contemporaries and predicted it exactly. He warned of eine entsetzliche Entwicklung. Die ganze Pyramide des kulturfähigen Menschentums verschwindet. Sie wird von der Spitze herab abgebaut, zuerst die Weltstädte, dann die Provinzstädte, endlich das Land. Nur das primitive Blut bleibt zuletzt übrig, aber seine starken und zukunftsreichen Elemente beraubt. Es entsteht der Typus des Welchen. Genau was wir jetzt beobachten. And he looked deeply into its causes. He wrote, wo Gründe für Lebensfragen überhaupt in Bewusstsein treten, da ist das Leben schon fragwürdig geworden. Da beginnt eine weise Beschränkung der Geburtszahl, das bereits Polybius als das Verhängnis von Griechenland beklagt. I observed that what best explains birth rates in the Muslim world is female literacy. Parts of the Muslim world have leapt from pre-modern to postmodern circumstances without passing through modernity in a time-lapse repetition of the experience of the West. But demographics is not destiny, contrary to Auguste Comte. We learned from Spengler that destiny, Schicksal, is sui generis. Heraclitus, the subject of Spengler's dissertation, said ethos anthropoi daimon, character is destiny. Spengler reverses this. Destiny is character. The guidepost of human events is Schicksal, the striving of a people to a common goal. And Spengler gives us an original phenomenology of Schicksal and national character that remains the standard for geopolitical judgment today. Political philosophy, so-called, deals with ideology, particularly in America, where ideology substitutes for historically rooted national traditions and takes on religious overtones. Spengler's understanding of Schicksal, by contrast, pervades our plastic and temporal imagination our mental reconstruction of nature, and above all, our sense of time. Kant's presentation of time and space as forms of intuition, Spengler complains, confuses mere extension with the constitution of time by human endeavor and its evocation of risk. Noteworthy is his reworking of Hegel's distinction between the ancient tragedy of circumstances and the modern tragedy of character. And he writes, Die Zeit ist das Tragische. Und im gefühlten Sinne der Zeit nach unterscheiden sich die einzelnen Kulturen. It's an unbelievable idea that I think exists nowhere else. Deshalb hat sich eine Tragödie großen Stils nur in den beiden entwickelt, welche die Zeit leidenschaftlichsten bejahten oder verneinten. Wir haben eine antike Tragödie des Augenblicks und eine abendländische der Entwicklung ganzer Lebensläufe vor uns. Destiny and time are bound up in hope and fear. As Spengler writes, die Worte Vergangenheit und Zukunft haben plötzlich eine schicksalsschwere Bedeutung erhalten. Aber diese Sehnsucht aus der Überfülle und Seligkeit des inneren Werdens ist in der tiefsten Tiefe einer jeden Seele zugleich Angst. Die Zeit ist kein Begriff, sondern ein Wort für das Schaffen, eine Bezeichnung für das Unnennbare. Der Raum ist ein Schauen, aber die Zeit ist ein Schicksal. Individual cultures are distinguished by the differences in their felt sense of time. What he calls das faustische Zeitgefühl ist ein leidenschaftliches Hinausgreifen in die Ferne, ein Wille zur Unendlichkeit. And as Faustian culture hardens into mere civilization, two concepts of time, two modes of being, contend in Faustian culture itself. The Wille zur Unendlichkeit und the Weltangst that it evokes ist sicherlich das schöpferischste aller Urgefühle. Ihr verdankt ein Mensch die reichsten und tiefsten aller Formen und Gestalten, nicht nur seines bewussten Innenlebens, sondern auch von dessen Spiegelung in den zahllosen Bildungen äußerer Kultur. There is an ambiguity here between Seligkeit and Angst, between Fatum and Schaffen, which Spengler does not resolve. The most creative of all feelings, Weltangst, arises from our perception that the werdende future will become the gewordene past. But he also tells that time itself is Schaffen, not experienced passively, but constituted by our making and doing. Our sense of time does not arise from passive contemplation of events, but from our own creative actions. As culture decays, the forward drive of created time slows into status. And he has an extraordinary insight into 19th century music. He observes this in dem Begriff des Stils, dem Sinn des Impressionismus und der Musik Wagners zugrunde liegen. Den Niedergang der Kunst, den wachsenden Zweifel am Werte der Wissenschaft. I have written extensively about Wagner and Debussy, and I believe that the analytical tools of modern music theory strongly validate Spengler's intuition. The goal-oriented motion of Baroque and classical composition embody this striving for the infinite. By contrast, Wagner and Debussy sacrifice the forward motion of time for the intensification of the moment. Wagner wrote, time is absolute nothing, only that which makes time forgotten, that destroys it, is something. Or as Rossini said, Wagner has some great moments and some horrible quarter hours. In other words, the sublimated Angst before the Gewordensein collapses into the horror of the moment, and the characteristic Wagnerian response is self-immolation, like Isolde, Brunhilde, Zente, and Kundry. Faust's wager with Mephistopheles is the consummate literary expression of these contending concepts of time and diverging destinies. Faust's soul is lost if he says to the passing moment, "Verweile doch, du bist so schön." Nietzsche takes the devil's side of the bargain. And Zarathustra declares, have you ever said yes to a single joy? Then you said yes to all woe. All things are entangled, ensnared, enamored. If you ever wanted one thing twice, if you ever said, verweile doch, du bist so schön, then you wanted it all back. And as Walter Kaufmann observes, this explains Nietzsche's strange theory of eternal recurrence. Now, Nietzsche did not invent this. The fetish of the ecstatic moment is the hallmark of the Romantics, for whom Spengler had contempt. He called die Romantik eine schwärmerische Imitation nicht des Lebens, sondern eine frühere Imitation. He refers to its fake medievalism, which Heine called a Kammaschen Rettertum. The Romantic tried to resuscitate a medieval world that never was, and, in the person of Richard Wagner, ultimately reverted to the old paganism that lurked under a Christian veneer. The Faustian time of infinite possibility contends with the Mephistophelian time of the ecstatic moment. Germany had zwei Seelen in einer Brust, two contending experiences of time, two destinies, one with Mozart and Beethoven, Goethe and Schiller, Hegel and the von Humboldt brothers, and another with Novalis, Otto Müller, Richard Wagner, and Martin Heidegger. Spengler kannte seine Pappenheimer. He was less insightful about American culture, which he dismissed out of hand, something like Alexander Gauland's insulting characterization of Americans as a zusammengewürfeltes Volk ohne eine eigene Kultur. I should like to correct Spengler's characterization of America, but by using his own methodology. If the feeling of time is the great differentiator among cultures, America and Germany are polar opposites. We Americans are a heterogeneous crew, but we didn't turn up in the North American continent by a roll of the dice, but by individual choice. The Gothic, Viking, Magyar, and other tribes who invaded Europe after the fall of Rome were converted to Christianity by their kings. Americans came to this new city on a hill as individuals. That is why America still retains the characteristics of its radical Protestant origins. Just as the sermon is the centerpiece of Protestant Gottesdienst, political rhetoric is the ritual content of American political life. Spengler should have read our national novel, Huckleberry Finn, in which Huck basically says he is the Christian pilgrim in John Bunyan's novel Pilgrim's Progress, the great document of radical Protestantism. But unlike the Christian in Bunyan's allegory, the American pilgrim can't complete his journey. The city on the hill glimmers in the distance like the point of perspective of infinity in a Renaissance painting. It cannot be reached by the roads of terrestrial politics. We Americans have no ethnicity as such. We have no inherited Sittlichkeit, no Hegelian Dasein absorbed from family and community. We do not march to the future as a collective, but we seek the heavenly city as lonely individuals. That's why Huck, at the end of the novel, simply starts his journey over again. Twain produced a literary failure, but a great piece of cultural diagnostics. Huck's successors in American culture are the cowboy who rids the town of evildoers and then rides off into the sunset, the gunslinger with a heart of gold, the private detective who avenges wrong and then fades into the urban nightscape, the loner with authority problems, Natty Bumppo, the continental op, Shane, Dirty Harry, Sylvester Stallone, all of them. The founding of the American Republic created a new time and a new destiny. Our first writer of importance, Washington Irving, in his story Rip Van Winkle, repurposed an ancient tale to instantiate what America's founders called the Novus Ordo Seclorum. Rip falls asleep in the Es war einmal of legend and wakes in the time of the new secular order of revolutionary America. To many of our friends around the world, it may seem that we were born yesterday. But that has a good side. We are uniquely disposed towards new beginnings. But it also explains why we can't write tragedy. Eugene O'Neill, the American writer who best attempted to write tragedy, writes sad stories with the internal structure of situation comedies. We don't have a tragic ending. We simply walk off and start again. We've never been able to reconcile the soul of a church with the commercial republic devoted to the generation of wealth. But as F. Scott Fitzgerald said, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. And Fitzgerald added, one should, for example, be able to see that things are hopeless and still be determined to make them better. He was a close reader of Spengler. That reminds me of the punchline of an old Jewish joke. Es ist verboten, dass ein Jude sagt, es gebe keine Hoffnung. Keine Chance vielleicht. Our sense of time arises from the unheimlich feeling that our culture will perish like all those who preceded us, but we create time through our actions. We're pessimists in spirit, but creative in practice. And within Spengler's framework, what can we say about Germany's destiny today? German idealism doesn't help much. Untreated space and time as symmetrical forms of perception, so that the ticking of the clock and the counting of paces amount to the same thing. Einstein finished off this idea in physics already. And as Spengler explains, time embodies the Angst and expectation of destiny, the Werden as well as the Gewordene. But to what end? Hegel says very little about time. He offers us the vorgeschriebene Reise of the Weltgeist, the certainty of the forward march of Vernunft. But without uncertainty, without Angst, we have no existential need to act in the present. Our sense of the present would shrivel into an arbitrary point on the long line of human progress. Spengler describes die ewige Angst vor dem Unwiderruflichen, Erreichten, Endgültigen, vor der Vergänglichkeit, vor der Welt selbst aus dem Verwirklichten, in dem mit der Grenze der Geburt zugleich die des Todes gesetzt ist, der Angst vor dem Augenblick, wo das Mögliche verwirklicht, das Leben innerlich erfüllt und vollendet ist, wo das Bewusstsein am Ziele steht. Time for Spengler is unidirectional. Auch die Richtung in allem Werden wird in ihrer Unerbittlichkeit, Nicht-Umkehrbarkeit von menschlichen Verstehen wollen wie etwas Fremdes und Feindliches mit Namen belegt, um das ewig Unverständliche zu bahnen. But time cannot be separated from freedom. Joseph Soloveitchik, the most influential Jewish thinker of the second half of the 20th century, observed that the first commandment given to Israel as it left Egypt was to mark time. The slave lacks time experience. To the slave, time is a curse. He waits for the day to pass. Life to the slave is motionless. He lacks the great excitement of opportunities knocking at the door, of challenges summoning him to action, of tense expectations and fears of failure. How do we resolve this tension? Perhaps Spengler is more of a prophet than philosopher, like Jonah, who knew with certainty that the city of Nineveh would be destroyed because God told him so. But Nineveh repented in sackcloth and ashes, and Nineveh survived. Biblical stories take the form of tragedy, but the tragic outcome is sometimes averted by character transformation. Now, is time really irreversible? In the physical world, Kurt Gödel showed, in a contribution to Albert Einstein's Festschrift, that general relativity implies the reversibility of physical time under special conditions. More recently, physicists have observed what appear to be negative values for time in certain quantum experiments. In the simplest sense, we may say that the nature of our past actions cannot be ascertained until we know to what end they lead. It is not only that the future is determined by the past, but the past is determined by the future. We cannot know the full import of our actions until we live through their consequences. The Germans could never agree on their destiny. There's Schiller's Mensch mit den Palmenzweige and Hegel's Weltgeist, the secular optimism of the German classic and the Prussian reformers. There's also the Augustinian strand of thought of Urs von Balthasar and Joseph Ratzinger. There's the Protestantism of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Just beneath the surface, there is an indispensable rabbinic contribution to German thought. So it very well may be that the future of Germany is sealed. Was noch bestritten bleibt, ist seine Vergangenheit. Is it possible to reach back in the past and grasp these different strands of German greatness, secular and religious, Protestant and Catholic, Gentile and Jewish? I don't know. But on Saturday, I went to the West End Synagogue, and there was a group of young boys, in their teens, and there was a bar mitzvah ceremony, the induction of a young adult into religious observance. It was the sort of thing that would be completely normal in the United States or Israel. But here in Germany, there are Germans who are also religious Jews. A new generation has appeared. So if Judaism can come back, why not German idealism or Augustinian Christianity? Let me just conclude on a personal note that it may seem a bit odd that a formerly pseudonymous gadfly appears before you in the livery of a foreign ministry. I can't discuss my work at the State Department, but in place of that, I would like to quote a few lines from a speech that Heinrich Heine delivered under similar circumstances. Mit Wölfe, ich bin glücklich, heut in eurer Mitte zu weilen, wo so viele edle Gemüter mir mit Liebe entgegenheulen. Mit Wölfe. Ihr zweifeltet nie an mir, ihr ließet euch nicht fangen von Schelmen, die euch gesagt, ich sei zu den Hunden übergegangen. Ich sei abtrünnig und werde bald Hoffart in der Lämmerhürde, dergleichen zu widersprechen, wäre ganz unter meiner Würde. Ich bin kein Schaf, ich bin kein Hund, kein Hoffart und kein Schellfisch. Ich bin ein Wolf geblieben. Mein Herz und meine Zähne sind wölfisch. Ich bedanke euch alle für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit.